Life in the colonies. Settling the New World. Colonial America is the time period from 1607 to 1776. In 1607, the first English settlement was founded. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. This made the colonies free from Great Britain. There were 13 English colonies in the New World. These colonies were grouped into 3 regions. The colonies within each region had similarities that held them together. Colonists arriving in the New World. New colonies in New England. New England started as one large colony. It was settled by 2 different religious groups. In 1620, the Pilgrims came over from England on the Mayflower. They started a colony in Plymouth Bay. The Puritans followed in 1629. They started the successful Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Pilgrims had a charter that promised them land in Virginia. On the trip across, their ship blew off course. New England colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Banned from Massachusetts. Roger Williams believed that there should be a separation of the church and government. His beliefs got him into trouble with the Puritans. He escaped from Massachusetts before the colony officials could send him back to England. He founded the colony of Rhode Island. There, the people had more religious freedom. Squanto. A Wampanoag Indian named Squanto saved the Pilgrims. He had been kidnapped when he was young. He learned English during his time as a slave, so he was able to teach the Pilgrims how to farm and live off the land. Unfortunately, they were not prepared for life in the North. They arrived right before winter. There wasn't enough food. They did not know how to plant crops successfully in the rocky soil. Half of the colonists died during the first winter. The Puritans received a charter for land north of Plymouth. Unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans arrived with plenty of food. They were prepared and did well the first winter. Soon, people moved out of Massachusetts to start other colonies. In 1636, small groups of people moved to the Connecticut River Valley. There, they found good farmland and many animals for fur trading. Roger Williams, a Puritan minister, founded the colony of Rhode Island. By 1679, colonists in New Hampshire broke away from Massachusetts to form a new colony. The Mayflower Compact. On November 11, 1620, Pilgrims landing at Plymouth signed the Mayflower Compact. This was the first set of laws in New England. It said that all members of the colony would accept the rule of the majority. The document also stated that laws must be fair to everyone. It set up a way for the new colony to work. Pilgrims signing the Mayflower Compact. Puritan religion and government. The Puritans wanted to simplify the Church of England. They did not believe that religion needed fancy ceremonies. Puritans thought that church members should all be equal. Once the Puritans were living in the new colony, they set up their own church. They made strict rules for all members of the colony to obey. Everyone in Massachusetts, whether they were Puritans or not, had to follow the church's rules. Talking with God. A woman named Anne Hutchinson got into trouble with the Puritan leaders. She believed that everyone had a right to talk directly to God. Anne held secret weekly prayer meetings in her home. When the meetings were discovered, she was told that she had to leave the colony and never come back. Male church members ruled the government. They met once a year to discuss problems in the colony. This group was called the General Court. The General Court elected the governor and the governor's council. Eventually, the colony got so large that the town had to hold elections for delegates to the General Court. Some towns also had town meetings. Only male church members were invited to these. At the meetings, the men discussed what was going on in the town. Many towns used these meetings as a way of governing the people. Making money by water. The Pilgrims quickly learned that their new home was not very good for farming. The soil was rocky and the winters were long. The Pilgrims could only grow enough food to feed their own families. So, the colonists in New England had to find other ways to earn money. In the early years, most colonists lived in towns along the ocean. It made sense that these men would become shipbuilders, traders, and fishermen. The forests inland provided trees for building ships. The many animals living in the forests helped fur traders become very rich. Metacom, also known as King Philip, was the leader of the New England tribes. King Philip's War. As the colonies continued to grow, more and more land was taken from the American Indians. Eventually, the Indians fought off to protect their way of life. All the New England tribes fought together. By 1678, 600 colonists were dead. More than 3,000 Indians were dead, and many others were sold into slavery. The New England Indians were never as strong again. The merchants in New England traded with the British and other colonies. Colonists sent furs, iron, lumber, fish, tobacco, and rice to Great Britain. England sent tools, guns, furniture, cloth, fine china, teas, and silks to the colonies. Fishermen in the port towns provided food for the colonists of the region. They caught clams, oysters, cod, and halibut. Some men also hunted whales. Whale blubber fueled oil lamps. The skin of the whales was made into purses and bags. The bones around the whale's mouth were used for combs and women's corsets. Young, smart, and brave. Phyllis Wheatley was kidnapped from her home in Africa when she was 7 years old. She was sold into slavery in Boston. She was a gifted writer. When she was a teenager, her first poem was published. Soon, a book of her poems was being sold in England and the colonies. Cod fishing in New England. Everybody's different. There is one word that describes the middle colonies: diverse. This means that the people who lived in these 4 colonies were very different from one another. In New England, most of the colonists were Puritans. In the middle colonies, each colony had a unique history. Much of the middle colonies was originally settled by Dutch and Swedish people. New York was called New Northerland when the Dutch controlled it. New York City was called New Amsterdam. Middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Peter Stuyvesant, governor of New Netherland. Slavery was everywhere. Slavery is usually associated with the South. That's because large numbers of slaves were used to plant crops on southern land. However, there were also slaves in the middle and northern colonies. Most of those slaves worked in homes as servants, nannies, or cooks. In 1664, King Charles II of England decided he wanted control of New Netherland. He threatened to start a war. The Dutch and Swedish settlers gave up their land without a fight. The king gave the land to James, the Duke of York. He was the king's brother. This land was divided into New York and New Jersey. William Penn owned the other 2 middle colonies, Pennsylvania and Delaware. His story is so interesting that we'll have to tell it on the next page. King Charles II. Friends of a king's brother. The Duke of York gave New York and New Jersey to 2 of his friends. It seems that they knew how to pick their friend. British take over New Netherland. William Penn's Woods. William Penn was not very popular in England. He was a member of the Society of Friends. This was a religious group that was also known as the Quakers. Quakers believed everyone was equal. They did not believe in fighting or war. The Quakers were not very well liked by the British people. Penn realized he needed to get away. Luckily for him, King Charles II had once borrowed money from Penn's father. So, Penn asked the king to repay the debt with land in the colonies. In 1681, the king gave Penn a land grant for the area that is now Pennsylvania. Document describing how the king gave Pennsylvania to William Penn. This is William Penn right here. First, last, or in between. In 1682, Penn gained the land that is now Delaware. It was one of the last colonies to be founded. But when it was really counted, this tiny colony was first. Delaware's delegate was the first one to ratify the Constitution. This means that Delaware is considered America's first state. In his colony, Penn wanted to be able to create his own laws. Quakers believed in peace and love. In Pennsylvania, people had freedom of religion. This means that they were not forced to belong to a specific church. Members of any religion could vote or be elected to office. Pennsylvania quickly grew to be the center of colonial America. Many important historical events occurred in its capital city of Philadelphia during the late 1700s. William Penn trading with the Indians. Relationships with Indians. William Penn and the Quakers dealt fairly with the Indians in their region. They didn't just take the land they wanted, they bought land from the tribes at fair prices. Penn agreed to a treaty of friendship with the chief of the Delaware Indians. The peace between the tribes and colonists lasted 70 years. Breadbasket colonies. When it came to farming, the middle colonies were the opposite of the northern ones. The middle colonies had hills and rich, fertile soil. The people who settled here established many small farms. The middle colonies were called the breadbasket colonies. Grain was plentiful. Women used the grain to make breads and sweets. The colonists exported wheat, barley, oats, and livestock to the south and to the British West Indies. Rivers flowed from the Appalachian Mountains to the ocean. These rivers made the land healthy. They also helped make trading very easy. Big cities. People might think that Boston was the largest city in the colonies. However, by the mid-1700s, Philadelphia had the largest population. New York City was the second largest city. Both of these cities grew because of the trade industry. Map of New York City in the mid-1700s. Farmers who lived inland could send their goods on the river. The boats took the goods to the port cities of Philadelphia and New York. There, the products could be loaded onto large ships. The middle colonies were also involved in manufacturing. The iron industry was very important. Iron was used to make guns, axes, and tools. Colonial farm near Baltimore, Maryland. A view of Philadelphia in the 1700s. Controlling trade, shipping. In 1660, England decided to control the trade to and from the colonies. They passed the Navigation Acts. Colonists could not use foreign ships. Tobacco, sugar, lumber, and furs could only be sent to England. Items from other countries had to go through England before arriving in the colonies. With these laws, England earned money from the colonists' hard work. The first and last colonies. The southern colonies were founded in 1607. The Virginia Company of London decided to get rich. The company was owned by English merchants. They wanted to go to the New World and find valuables to trade in Europe. King James I gave the Virginia Company a charter for land. Around 100 men and boys traveled to Virginia. They called their new home Jamestown after the king. Unfortunately, the area they chose to settle was swampy. There were swarms of mosquitoes and diseases spread quickly. The men looked for gold instead of getting their settlement organized and the crops planted. In 1608, so many men had died that Jamestown was in danger of disappearing. Starving time. A year after John Smith took over at Jamestown, he got hurt and had to return to England. The settlers fell apart again. From 1609 to 1610 is called the Starving Time. By the spring of 1610, only 60 men of the 500 who had been there were alive. Southern colonies. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. A man named John Smith became the leader. He said, "He that will not work shall not eat." With hard work, the colony was successful. Maryland was founded as a refuge or safe place for Catholics in 1634. North and South Carolina started as one large colony in 1663. They stayed as one colony until the early 1700s. Georgia was the very last colony to be settled. In 1732, King George II gave a charter for the land to James Oglethorpe. He settled the land. He was also responsible for building forts to protect the English colonies from the Spanish in Florida. The founding of Savannah, Georgia. Being poor is no crime. James Oglethorpe wanted Georgia to be a good home for poor people. He once had a close friend who died in prison. The man had been put in prison because he couldn't pay his debts. Oglethorpe wanted to create a colony where everyone would have a fair chance for success. Early Southern life. White male landowners ruled the governments of the southern colonies. Beginning in 1619, the House of Burgesses was the ruling body in Virginia. The members of the House of Burgesses were elected by the male landowners in the colony. The governor and his council were appointed by the Virginia Company and later the king. The founder of Maryland, Lord Baltimore, wanted the colony to have religious freedom. He was a Catholic and had been treated poorly in England. The colony had an elected assembly like Virginia's House of Burgesses. Indian relations. In March 1622, the Powhatan Indians of Virginia attacked English settlers in the region. One of the Indians, Pocahontas, had married a white man named John Rolfe. Their marriage had helped keep peace for many years before. But by 1622, Pocahontas and her father were dead. Pocahontas' uncle led the attacks and almost 350 settlers were killed. John Rolfe was one of the settlers killed in the attacks. Lord Baltimore. In Georgia, the founder of the colony tried to control the colonists for too long. For 20 years, James Oglethorpe tried to make all decisions for the people in Georgia. Finally, the British king made the land a royal colony. From then on, the king appointed a governor and council members. This is a colonial schoolhouse in the north. In the south, private tutors were more common. Schooling in the south. There were very few towns in the southern colonies. The people lived on farms that were very far apart. So, private tutors taught most children in their homes. Other children were sent away to boarding schools. Cash crops and plantations. Tobacco, rice, indigo, corn, and slaves. These words describe what made the southern colonies successful. The land in the south was very ideal for planting large crops. The growing season was very long. There were many rivers to keep the soil moist and fertile. Rice farming in Georgia. The indigo plant. A girl who saved a colony. Indigo is a blue dye that was used on military uniforms and dress clothes in the 1700s. A teenager named Eliza Lucas lived on a plantation in South Carolina. She experimented with the indigo plant and figured out how to produce it for trade to Europe. Her work helped the colonial planters become very wealthy. The South was famous for its large plantations. A plantation is a large farm that produces a single crop for profit. The crops raised on plantations were called cash crops. In Virginia, the main cash crop was tobacco. Tobacco and corn were produced in the Carolinas and Maryland. In South Carolina and Georgia, rice was a profitable crop. Starting with the 1740s, indigo became a cash crop for South Carolina. Planting crops and tending to them took a lot of work. At first, the planters used indentured servants. These were men and women who were very poor. They paid off the cost of their trip from England by working in the colonies. By the late 1600s, the plantation owners were using slave labor from Africa. John Rolfe. John Rolfe is famous today because he married the Indian princess Pocahontas, but he had a much more important role in colonial Virginia. In 1612, Rolfe figured out a way to dry tobacco plants. This drying method allowed the cash crop to be shipped to Europe. Tobacco plants drying. Slavery in America. Slave trade was a very profitable business. The process of bringing a slave to the colonies started in Africa. Ships from the British West Indies and the colonies traveled to Africa. There, they took human captives. These men, women, and children had been kidnapped from their homes. They did not speak English. Can you imagine how scared they were? They had no idea what was happening to them. They were put on the ships and taken to the colonies. Most of them were brought to the South. The large plantations needed labor. Since there were no plantations in the northern and middle colonies, there were fewer slaves there. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean was called the Middle Passage. Many slaves died during the terrible journey. Slaves being brought to Jamestown. How many slaves? By the 1760s, there were about 230,000 slaves in the colonies. Only 16,000 of those were in New England. By 1800, approximately 5 million slaves had been taken from Africa. Historians think that 50% of these captives died during the Middle Passage. Once they reached the colonies, they were sold into lifelong labor. Few slaves were granted their freedom. Even fewer were able to buy their own freedom. It took almost 200 years to get rid of slavery in America. Famous black colonists. Benjamin Banneker was a free black man. He eventually helped plan Washington, D.C. Olaudah Equiano wrote a book on his slave experiences. Phillis Wheatley was a slave who became a famous colonial poet. Slavery was a very ugly part of colonial life. However, the colonists also left us many positive legacies. They fought for freedom of religion, and they created a society with many different ways for people to earn money. Their choices led to the American way of life.